The mosques are our barracks. The minarets are bayonets. The domes are helms. The believers are soldiers. This was the Islamist poem quoted by then Mayor of Istanbul in December 1997 in the Turkish province of Siirt. Charged with using inflammatory speech by the Ankara High Court, he served a sentence in jail. It was originally for 10 months. He served perhaps 4 months, and was ejected from office. After serving the sentence, the mayor, of course, Recep Erdogan, would go on to lead and become the president of Turkey. At the moment, a decade long into his presidency, secular Turkey, which is a member nation of NATO, slides quite openly towards an Islamist future. And I'd like you to remember that the members of the Ankara High Court who convicted him for inflammatory speech were themselves Muslims. As an anti-Islamist Muslim, and that's the capacity in which I'm here today, I refuse to give up Islam to the Islamists. I'm a granddaughter of Muslims born in India. Our family is deeply reared in a pluralistic Islam. Yet today, pluralistic manifestations of Islam are contracting and contracting rapidly and contracting globally, whether you live in the Muslim majority world or whether you live in the Muslim diaspora, and I have lived in both. There has never been a time when Islam has been more threatened than from within, from a war within its own folds. And that threat has two formations. One is ideological, and the other is sectarian. As Muslims confront what I call political Islamism, these rifts, sects between different Muslims, are deepening at an extraordinary rate. We're not really dealing with rifts so much as tectonic plates. We are in an unprecedented age of conflict, and many of those conflicts we've touched upon in the last couple of days, and even this session, much of our interest has been focused on in Syria and Iran, but those are not the sole places of our concern. Make no mistake, this conflict within Islam is being waged, is originated from Muslims, is being waged by Muslims. The victims are, in the vast cases, Muslims, and is being waged in the name of Islam by Muslim Islamists. All Islamists are Muslims, but not all Muslims are Islamists. The blurring of these boundaries is what Islamists thrive upon. And so far they get away with this blurring because few are challenging this narrative. Most dangerously, Islamists claim to own an official narrative to Islam. They claim to be the true or authentic or pure version of Islam, and in doing so occupy the public space and suffocate all other diversity, challenging the legitimacy for any other view. They conceal their totalitarian ideologies in this veil that looks like faith. Today, whether we consider Egypt, Iraq, or Pakistan, and Pakistan is of particular concern to me because of my Pakistani heritage, they are rapidly suffocating the shared public space, which is why we see, for instance, the mass exodus of Christians in many different settings. And we are also seeing similar marginalization and, to some extent, exodus of minorities of other faiths too, including minority Muslims. Islamists are masters at mobilizing the masses, and they're very much helped by our own ignorance as Muslims of Islam, as well as a very carefully constructed political narrative, which is virulently anti-Western, virulently anti-secular, virulently anti-Semitic, virulently anti-Zionist. That is almost become an entrenched part of their belief. Anyone who claims that the conflicts that we are confronting now, whether we think about the upheaval in Egypt, whether we think about post-conflict Iraq, whether we think about Syria, whether we are concerned with Libya, whether we are observing transitions of power in Pakistan, anyone who claims these conflicts or changes are dissociated from Islam is dangerously dishonest. And in this dishonesty, endangering both Muslims and Muslims alike. Yet nowhere is this dishonesty seen when we examine the Middle East. At the moment in Syria, we know we have in power Alawites pitted against Sunni and Salafist extremists. In Egypt, Islamists briefly installed in power, that was a very predictable outcome, are now pitted against secular and mainstream Muslims. Sunni Islamist policies are legitimized by Pakistan's democracy, and I use that with appropriate ascorbic tone in my voice. Sunni Islamist policies have abrogated or hybridized a Sharia law onto the constitutional architecture of Pakistan, so that Pakistan is a democracy which constitutionally, legally persecutes minorities and is not held accountable for it in any arena which would protect the vanguard of human rights. In the Afpak region, a region which I have recently visited to meet with child jihadists, ever more children are at risk and are inducted into the Pakistani Taliban in the service of jihadist ideology. When you talk to these boys, aged 10 to 20, and we'll learn more about this tomorrow when I speak to you at that session, they are doing so for a purer, more noble Islam, and particularly to exact vengeance on what they see as minority Muslims. Nearby, Lebanon is poised to reignite in sectarian conflict, and most recently, the fanatical anti-secular view of the Pakistani Taliban revealed itself in a really brilliant strategic approach to eliminating the anti-polio vaccination campaign, which they paralyzed for over a year, and did so knowing that it was a global bargaining chip. Very important, Islamists can be Sunni or Shia or other sects, but in all instances, Islamism is associated with a central tenet of reinvented violent jihadism. This is a new invention. The 20th century birth of Islamism coincides with the birth of modern-day jihadist ideology. And though Islamists may be violent or non-violent, the non-violent seemingly appearing to be more moderate, which is part of their deadly stealth, they are all taking an entrenched position of anti-Western, anti-secularization. They make no mistake, Islamists seek not political participation with representation, they seek absolute political domination in the way a totalitarian party would seek. Erdogan himself is quoted as saying, "Democracy is a train. We take a ride in it and we get off when we reach the station of our destination." And I think you would agree that this is what we saw transpiring and what led to the outing of President Morsi in Egypt recently. It was only later that Egyptians realized he had boarded a one-way train. We must reclaim this dialogue as Muslims, and in order to have this conversation, as the Muslim world becomes ever more complex, whether in the diaspora or whether in the Muslim majority world, in the United States or in the West, where I speak and I publish, and as do my colleagues, the environment for debate and study of Islamist political ideologies in science has become increasingly hostile. There are strictures around the public discourse where words are not allowed or accepted, and a dialogue such as I'm having with you today may be smeared with accusations of Islamophobia. This mounting intimidation of the Islamist benefits only him. And ironically, in a country which prizes free speech and particularly intellectual and untrammeled exchange of ideas, we find the political left is most rapidly contributing to restrictions on this dialogue. They do so because they conflate political Islamism, which is a religionized totalitarian politics, with religion, which is not politics. And at the same time, these left-leaning individuals also issue the very real role of religion and culture in political conflict by affording political Islamism protections reserved for faith, which are sacrosanct and protected in the United States. They're actually sheltering a menacing totalitarian ideology. There's no question that forces are gathering, and the gathering forces are readying for a confrontation not only between Islamists and non-Islamists, but deepening the abyss between major sects in Islam. And I think that's perhaps been the most fearsome and frightening outcome of the Arab awakening or Arab tsunami or Arab tumult, whichever way we now describe it. The sects of Islam were always divided, almost from the end of the lifetime of the Prophet, so for centuries, but never has the conflict been so armed and so powerful and so deep as we are seeing today. It's worth mentioning, as many of my esteemed colleagues at this meeting have already brought to our attention, that the United States is indeed at the end of a decade of warfare which self-admittedly launched in a vacuum of knowledge about sectarian forces at play within Islam. And many of the architects of the original wars at the time of Afghanistan or Iraq will admit this today. We now are seeing, as our president in the United States is hoping to end conflict in the region, ourselves on the brink of re-engagement in Syria without the ability to distinguish between political Islamism and Islam. And the consequences may be even graver. As a Muslim, and as a Muslim with particular experience in Pakistan, I see the outcome a little bit more, perhaps pessimistically. If an Arab awakening is to eventually result in nascent governments of some kind, my guess is they would seek what I would call a template rather like Pakistan's, which is not by any means an ideal, and in my eyes, neither valid as a democracy. To me, that is a horrifying thought. A nation that I would say is pseudo-Islamic, though it sees itself as an Islamic republic. It has all the organs of democracy. That means there is a Supreme Court, there is a parliament, there are elected members. But it has none of the spine. There are sectors of Pakistani population who do not have electoral representation. There are minorities who are identified as less than and denied certain significant rights. My colleague, Mr. Tariq Fatah, will probably expand more on Pakistan in due course. And because Pakistan lacks the values that are innate to democracy of championing pluralism and safeguarding minorities from political disenfranchisement, no amount of the architecture of democracy can ever elevate that society from anything other than the rule of a tyrannical majority. Unless we confront Islamism, or unless we castrate Islamism, we are only going to see a region with similar such pseudo-democracies which benefit really only the tyrannical powers in majority. A Muslim's best protection from political Islamism has to be secular democracy. And at the time of writing, I don't see any such secular democracy forming. In closing, I would just say that without question, The outcome of the Arab awakening depends very much on opposing both political Islamism as an ideology and its fervent Islamist adherents, whether they be violent or non-violent. And if anti-Islamist Muslims, Muslims who wish to pursue civil Islam or pluralistic versions of Islam, do not rise to the urgent challenge, do not make the narrative more complex to help our colleagues who are also in this battle with us, it is not only the minorities who will be rendered extinct, but Islam itself. And failing to act now invites Islamists ever inwards. Political Islamism has been a much more pressing anxiety for 35 years or so, starting with the Ayatollah's Iran in 1979. And I see it as a far graver threat of more immediacy than a nuclear-powered Iran. Remember, we have a nuclear-powered Pakistan because political Islamism is an attractive ideology to masses of individuals. But if we don't act now and Islamism is invited ever more inwards, before too long, we will indeed find that our mosques will have become their barracks, our minarets will have been remade into their bayonets, our domes will now be their powerful helms, and our fellow believers no more Muslims, but devoted Islamist soldiers. Thank you.